Great. Well, so the first thing I actually want to do is I'm going to paste a link in the chat here. If you all can click on that. So the first thing we're going to do is just a quick like brainstorming exercise just to kind of get ourselves oriented to what we're doing here today. In terms of what are some of the biggest challenges that tend to come up in your work with students. And some things to consider there, right? Maybe specific skills or tasks that those students might struggle with. If there are like study habits or strategies that you see students kind of struggling to use effectively, but also including things like emotional and motivational barriers, because those can also affect our students' academics as well. So if you click on that link that I've pasted in the chat, it'll take you to the poll. It asks you to put in 5 different responses. You don't have to fill all of them in. You can put in as many as you can think of. But the idea here is that it's going to be used to form like a word cloud with your responses and then the responses of the folks who have participated in the training before. And so like a one word or a short phrase or things like that will work really well for that. So everybody just take a minute to kind of jot down a couple of ideas in terms of big academic challenges that you see students typically struggling with. And it's probably a little hard to see because this is getting very big. I'm going to try to zoom in on my screen a little bit. But you can kind of see how we've got, a number of responses so far from you guys, as well as from some of the previous groups. And you can kind of see the big trends, right? So the larger words in the middle are the ones that people have put in more frequently. And then we have all of these other ones around the edges where there's all these other issues that are often kind of related to what's coming up most commonly in the middle. So biggest one we have in the middle, I think probably no surprise if you've worked with our students for any length of time management. Also things like motivation, focus, attention, engagement, planning, right, kind of goes along with time management there. Confidence, I really think, is another really important one to mention here. Self-confidence that people are also mentioning. Communication confidence specifically. So what we will often refer to as kind of self-advocacy skills for students, the ability to kind of speak up and ask questions when needed and get the support they need when they need it, something that we very often see students struggling with. I'm wondering if anybody would like to unmute themselves briefly and just say a word or two about something that you added to this list. Either, that's one of the big ones in the center or something more specific that not as many people have come up with, but something that you kind of want to emphasize or talk about today in terms of a challenge that you've seen students struggle with.
I didn't write this one down, but oh, where did it go? Appropriate language is one that I forgot to mention. That is one that I struggle with, like how to address the student and everything, since we are somewhat on the same playing field, since we're both college students and everything. So that's one that I didn't initially add to my list that I submitted, but
Yeah.
that one I really do like, whoever put that one in there.
And so are you thinking appropriate language in terms of the way that you as a mentor are speaking to the student? Is that what you're kind of indicating there?
How the students speak to others.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. And that maybe connects in with what Connor has just mentioned in the chat, which is social awareness, right? So he says social awareness for me is a big one for some students, especially in bigger groups. Knowing when to talk and when not to talk has been a challenge this year for some. Yeah. Excuse me. I think that this is a really important point because this is a set of skills that we kind of tend to talk about under the umbrella of social skills, right? And social support for our students. And there's actually some of this that we're going to go into in terms of like how to support students with those skills in our training on social skills and social support, which will be next semester. But I think that both of you have hit on something important, which is that those things also affect academics, right? So students working in groups, it's going to affect their academics if social skills are a problem, or even students sitting in a college classroom and knowing how to interact appropriately with a teacher, how to interact appropriately with other college students, and how do we support students with that. So I think that that's kind of a really good indication of the way that all of these different challenges that students have kind of intersect with and overlap with each other. Um, Glenn mentions in the chat, one challenge I encountered was emotional challenges. And Glenn, could you say a little bit more about that? What kinds of emotional challenges come up? How does this affect students academically?
Well, one time when we were in the old bookstore at one of my students needed to buy a Tooks textbook, but he didn't have the right payment method, and he got really frustrated and lashing out. So I called in Tommy, our supervisor, so that he could help us with the situation. And my student calmed down, and the next day he got the right payment and got the textbook.
So those issues of kind of frustration of, how are students able to deal with those setbacks as they're coming up. Academics can be a big challenge. It can be a big source of stress and a big source of frustration for students. And so those emotional self-management skills also are kind of coming into play and becoming a big factor there. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And then Maddie, would you like to share anything that you included on the list or anything that kind of sticks out to you?
Yeah, I said blocking or chunking, like it seems a lot of things, even a single assignment, seem very overwhelming to them at first. And I think it kind of deters them from thinking that they can either do well on it or thinking that they can get it done. But I think something with like blocking and chunking it down is focusing on one thing at a time, I found really helps them if they can put all their thoughts into one thing at a time, rather than looking at the big picture and being super overwhelmed and not knowing how things are going to fit into each, rather than being able to look at one thing, focusing on one thing at a time, especially if there's motivation issues at the moment, like they're really not in the mood to do it, or they've had an overwhelming day, or any outside factors too. It helps to break it down one at a time, and especially really explain that one task. So really just put aside the rest of it so they can treat it like it's that's the whole task. Like that's a single task, and then move on to the next one like it's a separate task.
That's a really, really good way of putting it. And I'm really glad that you brought this up, because this is going to be one of the kind of primary areas that we're focusing on today, is this idea of breaking things down, right? Because I think that when we're looking at all of these different things that students struggle with, so much of it comes down to the idea of knowing how to manage large and complex and multi-step tasks without getting frustrated, without getting stressed, without getting overwhelmed, kind of being able to work through things in a methodical manner, taking things one step at a time, exactly as you said. And so that's one of the things that we're actually going to talk about a bit today, is how do we help students take something that might seem overwhelming or even impossible to them, like, oh, you have to write a 5-page essay for this class. If they've never done that before, and if they're having a hard time kind of envisioning what all the different pieces of that task are, that can feel very overwhelming, to the point where it will affect the student's motivation, right? If they feel like they can't do it, they're not going to be motivated to even get started. And so helping them find that first little step, what can we do right now as one tiny chunk of this larger thing? And I think exactly like you said, helping them to kind of put their focus on that, it can reduce that feeling of being overwhelmed. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because that is definitely one of the things that we're going to be focusing on today.
Thank you.
So yeah, just to kind of give a brief overview of what today's going to look like. So this training is called Academic Coaching and Executive Function Support. So we're focusing on how we support our students academically, and we're doing it kind of from two angles. One is we're bringing in the idea of academic coaching, which we'll talk a little bit about what that is and how we do it. And secondly, we're going to be talking about executive function. So the first thing we're going to do is reviewing what executive function is. If you've been working with us for a while, this might be something you've heard. I'll just try to kind of review and pull together a general definition of what it is we're talking about there and why it's important for our students. Then we're going to talk a little bit about going back to our core principles. So if you remember on this mentor actions and principles handout that we discussed in the last training, this top left box, the gray box here called our core principles, we have 3 main principles that we kind of try to embody when we're working with our students. And so we're going to just talk briefly about how those relate to academic support specifically. Then we're going to be focusing on two main skills for academic support today. So the first one is supporting executive function by exactly what Maddie was just talking about, breaking things down. How do we simplify and help students find what the next step in a kind of overall complex project might be? The second skill that we're going to focus on is academic coaching using the method of asking guiding questions. This is something that you probably are doing a lot with your students already, maybe without thinking about it too consciously. But I just want us to get in the habit of thinking about this as really one of the most powerful tools in our tool belt for working with students, and thinking about how to really frame our questions in the most productive way possible to kind of help guide the student toward a solution. And then at the end, we'll have a very brief survey similar to what we did last time, where I'll just ask y'all for feedback on the training. So let's start with Disability 101 review and more generally the concept of executive function. So if you don't fully remember everything in Disability 101, no worries. I know a lot of you looked at that quite a long time ago, but just trying to pull together what you know from there or from other areas of your life, anything you can remember about executive function, what it is, and why it matters in our work with students. Anybody give us, a point to get started with? It's okay if you don't have a complete definition, but anything you can kind of remember or say about executive function.
It's the set of mental skills that involves time management, self-control, and flexible thinking.
Yeah, that's a really, really nice definition, actually. So it's a set of mental skills or cognitive skills. And you mentioned a couple of things that can affect time management, self-control, and flexible thinking. Absolutely. Does anybody else have anything to add to that?
Something like the key factors to focus on in order to be successful.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that essentially, if you think about it as kind of a set of cognitive or mental skills that we utilize when we're trying to engage in goal-oriented action, right? It involves planning, time management, organization, kind of knowing which steps you need to take in which order in order to achieve your goal. So I think we've pretty much covered everything we have here. Anytime you're making a step-by-step plan, that's utilizing your executive function skills. Getting started is maybe one that we didn't talk about, but actually initiating a task. So if you think about it, like anytime you're trying to get started on something, especially if it's something that's difficult or something you've been putting off or a task that's a little bit unpleasant, there's always this feeling that you kind of have to overcome a barrier in order to do it, right? You have to kind of like climb a little bit of a mountain and then you can actually get started. That is a task or a skill called initiation or getting started. That is an executive function skill. Breaking down complex tasks, so very specifically what you were talking about earlier, Maddie, is a really, really crucial executive function skill. Being able to look at kind of the big picture and say, okay, I know I have to do this assignment that seems overwhelming, but what's my first step? How do I actually make forward progress on this today, right now? What's something I could do in 15 minutes that will get me one step closer? That is an executive function skill, being able to break down and find those entry points into a larger task. So why is this relevant to our work with students? A couple of things. One, executive function is a really, really huge factor in college success. If you think about the difference between high school and college, one of the really key differences is that in high school, a lot of this kind of executive function stuff is managed by other people, right? Maybe your parents are responsible for like reminding you of what needs to be done and helping you break down assignments. Maybe your high school teachers kind of help keep you on track and make sure they're constantly following up with you to make sure you're getting your work turned in. When you go into college, all of a sudden, you are the one who is responsible for all of those things. And none of your professors will probably even know what other classes you're taking. They're not going to know that you have 3 finals on the same day at the end of the semester and that you need to plan ahead for that. You're the one who kind of has to plan ahead. So that's one thing, is that executive function is kind of one of those things that becomes much more challenging as soon as you take that first step into college. And I think that's challenging for almost everybody during their first semester. But this is also specifically one of the biggest areas that's affected by our students' disabilities, right? ADHD is sometimes called an executive function disorder. So the executive function skills tend to be very one of the primary areas that are affected in students who have ADHD. But you will also see students with autism, students with intellectual disability will tend to struggle a lot with executive function as well. So just to run through very briefly this idea of our core principles and how this relates to academic support. So if I hop back over, the 3 core principles that we kind of had stated for the work that we do with students. Number 1, we offer adult-based and consent-based support. Number 2, we honor student experience, expertise, and advocacy. And number 3, we work toward independence and inclusion for all of our students. So how does this relate to academics in particular? The first thing I want to emphasize is with this idea of adult-based and consent-based support, there can be times where as a mentor, you might feel pressured to kind of be the homework police a little bit, where you might feel like your role is to kind of make, quote unquote, the students do what they're supposed to do, to push them to prioritize academics, to really urge them to get their assignments done and turned in on time. And the thing I want to say about that is that that does not really mesh with our idea of adult-based and consent-based support. Because as an adult, right, you all are adults, you all are college students. Part of being an adult is that you make a decision about what your priorities are. And that can change day to day. It can be based on what your values are, what your goals are in your life, but it is a very personal decision. And there's not necessarily anybody who can tell you what those priorities should be. If I think back to when I was an undergraduate in college, there were times when I decided to prioritize other things over my academics. Maybe I had family or friends who I hadn't seen for a long time visiting for the weekend. And I said, you know what, I'm going to let this assignment slide because I think it's more important for me to spend time with my family right now. Or maybe I would say, I'm going to put a little bit less effort into this assignment because I'm really burned out and I need to focus on this other area of my life. I need to make time for self-care, whatever it may be. The important thing is that as long as I made those decisions with kind of full knowledge going in of what the consequences would be, I had kind of thought about the pros and cons and made an informed choice that I was happy with, I still think those were good decisions, right? I don't regret any of those decisions. And if somebody had tried to kind of tell me, oh, you should be prioritizing academics in this situation, I would have felt disrespected by that, right? Because I was making the decision that I felt was best for me. Similarly with our students, if they are making informed choices that they feel satisfied with, then we as their mentors can feel like we have supported them in making the right decision. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same as the decision we would make. It doesn't have to be the decision we think is best for them in the long term. But the idea is helping them make informed choices, right? Helping them weigh the pros and cons, think about what their priorities are, think about what really matters to them. And if they make decisions on that basis, that is a good thing, in my opinion. That kind of is helping them to engage in this kind of adult learning style, engage in those independent living skills that we're trying to help our students develop. So that's all to say, academics is not always the number one priority, and that's life. And so our role as mentors isn't to push the students in one direction or another, to always prioritize their academics or whatever it may be. Our role is to help them to make the most informed choices, to kind of think of through their options and decide the option that they're going to be most happy with in the long term. To the point of honoring student experience, expertise, and advocacy and building independence. So this is where we get into some of the specific kind of methods that we are going to use to support students academically. So academic coaching is defined by CHADD, which is an organization that provides support for people with ADHD. They say academic coaching is a collaborative relationship that presumes the individual being coached is the expert, right? So coming back to this idea of student expertise, how do we do that in practice? How do we coach somebody in a way that presumes that they're an expert? We do this by asking guiding questions that help students to reflect on their own experiences and discover the strategies and the methods that are going to work best for them. So we're going to talk a bit more about what it means to ask guiding questions later on, and that's one of the kind of skills that we'll be practicing in the course of this training. But I just want to kind of connect that right now to this idea of this is part of how we treat students like adults and how we treat them as the experts in their own lives, and help kind of build that confidence and that sense of their own sort of efficacy and expertise as individuals. And connected with that, building independence. One way you can think about academic support is that academic support, when it comes down to it, is not really about academics, right? So it's if a student gets a good grade on their assignment, if they get a good grade in their class, that's awesome. We want that for them, but that's not really up to us as their mentors, right? We don't really have control over what grades our students get. That is going to really come down to what they decide to put into the class and how they are learning in that particular environment. What we can do as mentors is to utilize academics as a kind of practice case for all of these executive function skills that we want to help the students develop and learn and practice in the long term. So you can think of it as, you know, the students need effective executive function skills right now to get their homework done, to you know, get a good grade in their classes, to succeed in college. But those are also skills that they're going to need to get and hold down a job, to you know, pay their bills on time, to live kind of successfully as an adult in the world. And so we use academics as kind of like our case study or our kind of practice case for executive function skills. But really the goal is to help those skills develop and get more independent in the long term. So how do we provide that support in a way that kind of helps students build independence and develop those skills? We are using the method of providing supportive structure to do that. So going back to the mentor actions and principles list, everything that's under this green box that says provide supportive structure, these are methods that we use to model and to kind of help the student develop effective habits for executive function that they can then take with them, you know, in their future college career or even after college. So preparing a comfortable and distraction-free workspace, breaking a task into manageable chunks, creating a written checklist or action plan, incorporating visual aids or hands-on practice, and scheduling in a time to follow up. These are actions that we as mentors can do now, but in the long term, we want to kind of move toward having the students do more and more of that on their own, right? So we start by kind of modeling it and supporting them with those things. But as the students get more independent, they start being the one who is creating their distraction-free workspace. They are the ones who are creating the written checklist and action plan, and we're there just kind of supporting them through that. So these are the skills that we kind of use as mentors to support students in developing effective executive function. And I want to zoom in particular on this bit about breaking a task into manageable chunks, because that is, I think, the trickiest one to kind of master as a mentor. And as Maddie was saying earlier, really one of the keys to helping students get more effective at this. You know, if you have a student who's so overwhelmed that they can't even get started, that's going to be a huge barrier to their success, both in college and in later life. And so that's the skill that we're going to zoom in on and practice today. So let's get started. Let's talk a bit about supporting executive function by breaking things down. Why and when would it be beneficial to help a student break a task down into chunks? Let's start with that question. What kinds of, let's frame it maybe as, if you're sitting in a mentor session, what kinds of student situations or what kinds of student behavior or whatever might you see that would lead you as a mentor to think, oh, maybe I should help this student break a task down?
I think one of the biggest times it would happen would be with, say, a big project or something, breaking it down into more manageable chunks. parts. So there's most likely just pieces that they can do on their own, pieces that they think they need to do with you, breaking it down so it's more manageable and time. You can teach time management along with that.
Mhm. So anytime there's a big project, I think that's exactly right, that you see, there's a group project, there's an essay, there's a presentation or a speech they need to do, whatever it is, something that's a big, complex, multi-step task. Chances are the students will really benefit from you kind of helping them break it down. Anybody else have any thoughts about situations or things you might see as a mentor that would lead you to say, okay, I should help this student break this down a bit more?
I think if they're asking for something to be explained over and over again,
Mhm.
like the same thing, and it's just not really processing for them, I think it'll be beneficial to like really dive into it with them, because
Mhm.
I'll like, for obvious reasons, it's not clicking for them. So I think if they're asking for help about the same thing over and over again,
Yeah.
that's kind of like their way of telling us that they need help.
Yes, absolutely. And that's also a place where a couple of other things on this list. So either creating a written checklist or using a visual aid. If you're ever in a situation where you're repeating the same thing verbally to a student like 2 or 3 times and you're not 100% sure that they're getting it, bringing in some kind of visual representation. So either just pulling out a piece of paper, or if you're working online, just opening up a Google Doc and jotting down some notes as you're talking, so that the student can both see and listen at the same time. Or even just like sketching out like an outline or a mind map or whatever of, here are the different chunks or phases of this project that you need to do. Here's a timeline showing you the different steps, and we'll put dates on that. So any kind of like visual or written representation to reinforce what you're saying verbally is often going to be really helpful in those situations. But I think you're exactly right. That's a time to kind of say like, okay, we need to slow down and maybe zoom in on one particular thing and start pulling it apart a little bit, because the student is kind of not getting the big picture here. Any other examples of situations that might come up where you might want to use this method? I think what you all were mentioning earlier in terms of those emotional cues. You were mentioning a lot about students appearing stressed, or students appearing overwhelmed, or students kind of lacking motivation, not really wanting, seeming hesitant to get started on tasks. Those are actually really good times to do this as well. Because often if a student is, even if it looks like they're just avoiding a particular task, like they've been procrastinating on it, or you propose working on it with them, they're like, oh no, I'll do that later. That often can be a signal that there is some kind of anxiety or negative emotion associated with that particular task for that student. And very often that is coming from that kind of breakdown of executive function, where the student is trying to imagine what it even looks like to get started on that task, and it just becomes immediately overwhelming. And so they say, no, I'm just not even going to think about that right now. Right. So anytime you see that, like avoidance, procrastination, lack of a motivation, stress, anxiety, feeling overwhelmed regarding certain tasks, that it also can really be helped in a lot of cases by breaking things down. So how do we actually break tasks down to make them more manageable? Obviously, this is going to be like a really individual kind of thing, right? So how far you actually need to break it down, how granular and tiny you need to make each step, is going to depend a lot on that particular student and what their level of comfort with the task is, right? But to give some kind of general best practices when you're helping students break tasks down, how do we actually make tasks more manageable? Number one, making sure to include a concrete action verb that is something the student can easily visualize doing. So what does this mean? If we have something on our to-do list, or something, that somebody's telling us to do, and the action verb involved is not something that I can imagine myself sitting down and doing right now, I am much less likely to actually follow through on that task. So I found this for myself. To give you an example, like from my personal life, if I have like a to-do list, and one of my items on my to-do list is, I know I need to find out when this upcoming event is happening and put it on my calendar. That is a task that I will typically just kind of leave on my task list and not really get to for a long time. And the reason is very simple, because the verb find out doesn't tell me what I actually need to do. How do I find it out? I don't know. And I found that this may seem silly, but try it for yourself. I think you'll actually find this makes a big difference. Rewriting that to say, email such and such to ask them when this event is happening, or even something simple like Google this event name to find out the date when it's happening and add it to my calendar. So by changing it from find out to email or Google or whatever the method is, the actual verb I'm going to do to find it out, it makes it much more manageable. It kind of makes me realize, oh, this is something I could do in like 2 minutes. And then I can easily check it off my checklist. So a concrete visualizable action verb actually is going to help make that task more manageable for a student. Another thing that I think is important to think about is if you think about a task as kind of like you're navigating a map almost, and you need to create a clear pathway of steps. One step leads to the next step, leads to the next step, and it has to start from where the student is right this second, right? So you're creating an interconnected series of steps that's going to take the student from where they are right this second to the final product. If you kind of try to set that first step and make it a big leap that the student can't immediately get to from where they are right now, they're not going to be able to make that jump. It's going to kind of shut them down and they're not going to get started on that task. So kind of creating that breadcrumb trail almost of intermediate steps that lead the student from point A, where they are right now, to the finished task. Similar to that, getting rid of any kind of hidden or assumed steps in the process, thinking about what information or materials the student needs in order to get started, and actually adding in steps to get that information, get those materials, is going to help a lot. And then the last thing is, when possible, defining some kind of clear endpoint. If you don't know when the task is done, you're going to be much less motivated to actually get started on it. You're going to have a much vaguer idea of what it is you're actually trying to accomplish or what you're supposed to be doing. So trying to define a clear endpoint so you can tell when the task is actually done. So let's do a little bit of hands-on practice with this. So there's not necessarily one right or wrong answer here. Again, exactly how you would break some of these things down might depend on a particular student, but I just want to get us thinking in this way of pulling apart a task and trying to see what actually are all the different little steps that go into it. So I put a couple of example tasks that a student might struggle with on the left side here. So research Civil War history for a 5-page essay, apply for a part-time job, study for next week's bio test. All of these are kind of these complex multi-step tasks that might kind of stress a student out a little bit. So if everybody just wants to pick one of these, and I'll give you maybe like 2 minutes to just brainstorm. If you want to pull out a scratch piece of paper, you can type in chat, that also works, just to start brainstorming what are some steps that you could take, and thinking about, again, this idea of concrete action verbs, clear endpoints, creating that breadcrumb trail for the students through the task, thinking about any information or materials they might need. What are some next steps that you could potentially help the student identify to make these particular tasks more manageable? Yeah, so let's just start by talking about these. So Maddie has listed in the chat for apply for a part-time job. And Maddie, would you like to just list off some of the steps that you've used to break this down?
Yeah, so part-time job is kind of broad, which I mean, I know is the point, but it's so broad, and there are a range of part-time jobs that they could be interested in. So
Yep.
first, kind of find out what type of setting or what kind of work they'd like to do, whether it be like retail, do they want to interact with people? Do they want something more independent? Do they like being outdoors? Like, would they rather do something hands-on, like construction or like flagging, or even like a garden at Home Depot, something like that? Or would it be like they like fast food, interacting with people, something they'd be interested in? Just kind of first finding out what they'd be interested in, what doesn't make them miserable, I guess. And then from there, find out what type of locations that that have those jobs available to them. Also looking kind of location wise, maybe they want something closer to home. Obviously that's most convenient. So kind of looking at location and what kind of offers, like say if they live in Rutland somewhere, there's a Wendy's, a Five Guys, if they're looking at fast food, Starbucks, that kind of stuff. If they wanted something fast paced, that would be ideal. But if they wanted something more independent, something like Home Depot, or again, if they want outdoor outside at Home Depot would be ideal for them too.
Yeah, so thinking about taking these, so you had mentioned, so thinking about kind of what is the student actually looking for in their part-time job, right? What kind of work, what kind of setting, and then deciding on locations to apply for. If we wanted to kind of make these even more sort of concrete and having sort of a clear beginning, middle, and end point. If a student was kind of struggling with these, if you're like, okay, well, the first thing we need to do is to decide on what kind of part-time job you're looking for, right? Find out what you're actually looking for in a job. And the student's like, I don't know. Right? Well, how could we kind of break that down even further and turn that into something that maybe we could actually work on today together in the next, hour that we have together. So for example, if you're trying to decide on what kind of part-time job, you could make a task something like, write down a list of pros and cons for working retail versus in a more outdoor job, whatever it might be. But basically turning this into a activity that the student can actually get started on today during their time with you. Because often if we make it kind of open-ended or something that we're relying on the student to sort of think through and make a decision on their own, there's a tendency that for them to get stuck, right? So that would be an example of kind of, making this into a little bit more of a concrete task, something that they could work on today during their time with you. Similarly, deciding on locations to apply, something like make a list of 10 nearby locations to apply to. Right, so there we're kind of defining a clear endpoint. We're defining a clear action verb in terms of making a list. We know we're done once we have 10 of them listed. So then the student has kind of a very clear sense of here's exactly what the next step is, and they can kind of start to imagine what that actually looks like. So I think that that's exactly right. Helping the student think through, okay, before you even start on this, like putting in applications, you need to kind of do some information gathering and processing for yourself. You need to do some decision making. How can we turn that into a slightly more concrete task that we can work on together today? Awesome. Then I have Jess for research Civil War history. Jess, would you like to talk a bit about how you would break that test down for a student?
So how I normally break up things like this is reading an overview of the assignment to get the full knowledge of what you should be doing, and then forming questions or anything for the professor that you have regarding the assignment. Then secondly, suggesting gathering information first prior to the assignment, beginning the full assignment so you have all the information and historical information that you need to complete the assignment. And then any sources that you may want to, or need for the assignment. Then breaking it down and forming it into an outline so you can clearly see everything, and then moving forward into the full essay. So then you have all your information out there basically already, and just have to make complete sentences.
Awesome. And yeah, so starting, I think that this is always starting from what the assignment instructions are and actually walking through them with the student. And I really like the bit where you added writing down any questions that the student has for the professor. That's a very effective way to kind of ensure that they are recording any uncertainties or concerns they have, and then they can either email that to the professor or bring that list in and ask them after class, whatever it may be. So that's an excellent first step. In terms of, gathering the information and sources that they want or need for the assignment, if we were going to make that more kind of concrete or something that the student could do during their time with you, and something that has a clear endpoint for them, maybe something like saying like, go to the library and look up and let's say check out 4 books on what is this topic, Civil War history or whatever, right? So that's just an example of kind of, maybe the student will eventually need more than 4 books, but maybe as a starting point, we can kind of help provide that structure for them, help them see that there's a clear endpoint to this particular stage of the task, and this will help them to actually get started. So again, I think one way that's helpful to think about this is like, if you were going to do this today, right now, during your session with the student, what would that actually look like? Because if you can actually imagine that and help the student articulate what that's going to look like, that is going to help them move forward, right? If they can imagine doing it right now, that's much easier to get started on than if it's something that's very kind of vague or open-ended. So that's all awesome. So we talked about academic coaching and asking guiding questions as one of the primary methods that we use to help students succeed academically, but more importantly, become more independent in the long term. So what are guided questions? Guiding questions are open-ended questions, meaning a question that doesn't necessarily have one right answer, a question that can't really be answered by just yes or no, or ideally by just like a one-word answer, but questions that start with how or what do you think our options are for blank. Some examples, what would be the best way to blank? What would be the pros and cons if you tried blank? How has blank worked for you in the past? What other options do you think there might be? So these are some examples of open-ended questions that we could ask students. Guiding questions in particular are questions that are phrased in such a way that they help point the student in a helpful direction, but without kind of giving them the answer, or without just kind of trying to lead the student to one particular answer that we already know. So it's intended to actually open up a productive discussion and actually get some real feedback and some thoughts from the student. Just to give some quick examples here. So what kinds of situations might we use these in, and what would examples of those look like? So we have as one of our mentor actions, setting a session goal together. This is something you could actually do by asking a guiding question. For example, what are the biggest tasks on your mind this week? What would you feel happy to have done at the end of our time together today? Something that I will often ask a student at the beginning of a session is, what's the biggest thing that's stressing you out right now? And what's like one step that we could take to make that a little bit less stressful, to take that off your plate? So you're asking an open-ended question. You're encouraging the student to kind of reflect and problem solve for themselves, but you're also moving the conversation in a productive direction, right? You're kind of steering them toward the idea of, let's think productively about this. Let's kind of get into this problem solving mode. Let's try to find a solution. But at the same time, you are still showing genuine curiosity and respect for the student's perspective. So you're not just trying to get them to answer the way that you want them to answer. You're trying to actually get them to engage with you in kind of an unequal footing in a way. So just to kind of very briefly go through, why do you think we might want to use guiding questions like this in our work with students? Why might this be helpful?
To get them on task and help them accomplish their work.
Mm-hmm. So you as the mentor are providing this kind of directionality to the conversation, where you're kind of pointing the student toward their goals and toward this more productive direction. So that's definitely one thing. Why would it be better to ask a guiding question rather than just to like tell the student what to do, or to say something like, oh, I really think that you should work on your essay today because that's due in a week and you need to get started on it early? Might it be preferable to ask a guiding question rather than telling the student something like that? Has anybody ever used something like this with a student, kind of asking these open-ended but kind of guiding questions to help nudge the student in a direction?
I have, but personally, it helps put some of the ownership on them, allowing them to kind of take over the conversation, which is really nice. So they can open up about what they want to talk about. And it kind of puts the choices in their hands so they can make the decisions for themselves on what they answer and how they proceed with different things.
Absolutely. I think that you really hit the nail on the head. I really like the way that you use the word ownership, because I think that that's what this is by asking these guiding questions, we are recognizing that the student does have ownership over their academics, over kind of their priorities, their goals, their life decisions. And our goal as the coach is to kind of help keep pointing them back toward what those long-term goals are. So we as the mentor, by the way that we phrase the questions, we kind of try to frame the question in a way that is going to point the student toward their goals, toward that idea of what they want to accomplish. But we are letting them be the one who is doing the thinking and the thought process and making the decision for themselves. One other way you can think about it is that if you are only telling the student, I think you should do X, this should be your highest priority for today because this, and this reason. That means that you as the mentor are the one who is doing all the problem solving. You're the one who's getting all the practice in setting priorities and managing time and deciding what to do on a daily basis. And the student isn't getting the benefit of actually doing that thought process themselves, right? So what we want to do is to move from having the mentor be the one who is doing all that problem solving, all of that good thinking about what priorities should be and how we should solve this particular problem. And we're moving that thought process over to the student. So you as a mentor can phrase your question in a way that points the student toward the idea of like walking through this thought process and doing this problem solving, but you're actually letting them be the one who is doing the thinking in that situation, right? So these are questions that are intended to activate the student's thinking and activate their own problem solving process so that they can kind of get that experience. And that is really what's going to help them become more independent in these areas in the long run, right? So example of this, we talked a little bit about motivation earlier and how students might sometimes struggle to get started on working on particular goals. So you can bring the student back to that, right? Your role as mentor can be to point them to that goal that they have stated before, saying, you mentioned to me earlier that this was your goal, but it sounds like you're having a hard time motivating yourself toward that. That's understandable. Pretty much everybody has a hard time motivating themselves to take action toward their goals sometimes. How do you think you could motivate yourself to take action toward that goal, right? You're showing a lot of respect for the student when you ask them a question like this, but you're also kind of giving them the opportunity to practice thinking in this particular way, where they can actually step back and say like, how would I motivate myself to do this? And what you're doing in the long term is teaching the students to ask themselves these questions as kind of their first line of defense when they're engaged in problem solving. In some ways, you're kind of becoming like the voice inside their head in the future that is framing these questions in a productive way and helping steer the student toward a more effective solution. Well, so we are out of time. I'm going to paste in the chat a last link for you all. Go. If you have 2 or 3 minutes just to fill out a quick survey about this training, again, just about what you took away from it, anything that was especially helpful, any questions you still have that weren't covered here, that would be really, really helpful for me. So I will stay around for another couple minutes in case anybody has anything to talk about, but you all are free to go. Thank you so much for coming and for your great participation today.